up, everybody? Welcome to the IAG Thursday Thing. This thing we attempt like hell to do every Thursday, but sometimes the internet just says no. It just says no. But we persevere and find a way. Right now, I am trying to record this using my internet connection via a hotspot off of my phone. And we will see if we can make this work. We're gonna try. So we're gonna make every attempt here. And if this works, awesome. If it doesn't, those in the crowd, I love you for showing up, and we'll do our best. Okay. So today we're gonna go over the basics of heat exchangers. First things first, as usual, though, I want to throw a shout out to my usual partner in crime, who unfortunately can't make it here this week. Warranty. He's unavailable. He's got just way too much going on in life right now and can't make it. I also want to give a shout out to producer Jordan, the guy in the background who's helping us keep this edited and make it sound kind of nice. And he runs our Discord, and he's huge for the community. And then also Randy for that killer thumbnail this week. Man, that thumbnail, what's up? Randy also had himself a hell of a kart racing extravaganza over the weekend, and he's got some pretty sick video up on his Facebook of making some passes. That's pretty cool. So this week this is a topic I've been wanting to have for a while, because there's tons of misconceptions and about heat exchangers and what they are, how they function, things you should do, what you shouldn't do, yada yada yada. So we're gonna have a basic conversation about heat exchangers and kind of like basic rules of heat exchangers, real basic stuff. So this should be pretty good. And this should be one of those conversations that maybe you can send on to somebody later on, or people can come back and check out. Now, this is going to be fairly we aren't going to get too far into the weeds with this. This is going to be some, fairly higher level stuff of, just overlooking a lot of things. This is not going to get overly technical, but the concept here is to kind of point you in the right direction if you're on just how your basic heat exchangers work, and kind of some do's and don'ts and differences between them. And I put together some basic notes. I guarantee I'm going to glaze over some things, and I'm kind of hoping our Discord community, which you could be a part of if you just join. Every week, we try our damnedest to be live on our Discord and recording this at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And anybody can join. You just hop on Discord on your phone or whatever. You can join along in the chat. You can listen in. You can ask questions. You can even raise your hand and come up on stage, which is pretty cool. And then we also we take that recording, and it gets dropped over onto Spotify and Apple. So we get it both over there, and then you can listen to it later and forward it off to your buddies who need help with heat exchangers. So let's start from the top. Okay. What is a heat exchanger? What exactly is a heat exchanger? When we say heat exchanger, what are we talking about? Well, and most of this is going to be very Subaru oriented. I'm not saying these concepts don't work for everything, but I'm going to be talking in a lot of Subaru terms. Okay, this is the IAG Thursday Thing, and we are doing Subarus. Okay, so we're talking Subarus here. But what is a heat exchanger? A heat exchanger is something that basically you are trying to exchange heat from whatever this hot thing is into the air. You are trying to expel heat into the air. You're trying to exchange that heat with air that is moving through said exchanger to radiate it out. So first things first, the first and foremost heat exchanger that most people think of is a radiator. Okay. Radiators, the coolant in your engine, that carries heat from your engine to the heat exchanger. The air passing through then pulls that heat out of the heat exchanger. So coolant goes through it and back into your engine. Okay, that's literally how it works. There's nothing really that fancy to that. The next one that a lot of people don't realize how wildly related they are is intercoolers. Intercoolers are also a heat exchanger, but we're taking hot air, taking that heat, and then cold air passing through the heat exchanger. It's exchanging that heat into the fresh cold air that's coming through. So the air going into your intake charge is the pressurized air is cooler, and cooler air is going to be more dense. Therefore, you can make some more power with it, which is why we run an intercooler. It's also less heat going into your intake and into your combustion chamber. The cooler the air is, the less prone it is to causing knock and detonation. So the next one that gets overlooked a lot too is your oil cooler. Your oil cooler is also a heat exchanger. Same concept applies, just like a radiator, but oil is passing through it, and it is passing that heat onto the air that passes through. Or in the case of a Subaru, and we could be talking about air-water intercoolers too, which we'll get into a little bit. But oil coolers, they pass. You have hot oil that goes through, and most of them are air-air when we're talking about aftermarket oil coolers, or oil-to-air oil coolers. That heat exchanger exchanges that heat with the air, but your factory oil cooler actually tries to exchange that heat with coolant. So instead of air passing through it, it's actually a core around there that coolant runs through, and it's trying to pass that heat onto the coolant. So, factory STIs come with their factory oil cooler is basically an air water. There are some aftermarket radiators that also have an oil cooler portion to them. So there's a few different options as far as that goes. Okay. Now, one more thing I just got was in there. This is a relationship thing. With the stock STI oil cooler, and we will get into this, because that relationship works in both directions. If you can get your coolant up to temp before your oil, which in a lot of cases when you first start it, it does, it can also bring the temp of the engine up with it. Which, again, that relationship can help in both directions. It's basically just moderating. It's trying to regulate the temperature between the two is the concept. But long story short, energy makes heat. Okay? And heat destroys shit. This is why you want to keep things cool. In the case of like your radiator, if your coolant temps go too high, you can start to warp things like your anything that's aluminum. You get past a certain temperature, things start to do funny stuff, and you're putting a lot of heat in places it wasn't meant to be. In some cases, you can even you're raising the temperature around your combustion chamber, and it can cause knock problems. Okay, so you get too much temperature into that, and that will also translate into higher oil temps. Oil gets too hot, lots of different things happen. It starts to thin out. It can shear the hotter it gets. Long story short, oil becomes a lot less effective when you add heat. Oil temps or oil pressures tend to drop with heat too. And once you start dropping a whole bunch of oil pressure, you end up having metal on metal, and that's when we have bearing problems. So no good. And then in intercoolers, if you get your intake air temperatures too high, your ECU will freak out, or in some cases you can cause knock and all sorts of stuff. But your ECU is looking for a particular air temperature, and if it doesn't happen, it gets pissed. So, Radiators are fairly simple. Okay, we all know where this thing is. It sits in the front of the car, and the reason um most heat exchangers sit in the front of the car is if you are traveling through the air, you want the air to go through the heat exchanger. Okay, factory ducting on a lot of cars tends to really favor the radiator. Um, there's also one heat exchanger that gets added into this situation for a lot of factory vehicles that people don't realize. And that is your AC condenser is also a heat exchanger, and that sits in front of your radiator in most factory vehicles. That can actually be quite the restriction of cold air getting through your radiator. So one of the things we just recently did is we released a radiator. We haven't quite got it to the market yet. A few of them have sold because we got some like early ones in, but the main glut of them have not shown up. But basically, we started working with PWR on making a radiator, and the reason this radiator had to exist was almost purely out of necessity for VA track cars. VA chassis cars cool like shit. It's just they're awful for it. Something with the shape of the front end, the ducting sucks. You stick a front mount intercooler in there, it takes up, half of the surface area. So you really don't have a lot of air that can get through there that isn't already getting heated all to hell. VAs suck for cooling. There's just no getting around it. So we worked with PWR to make a radiator, and there's a few cool things about this, but basically you have a couple of different options for your radiators out there. Your normal factory radiator is a very basic tube fin single core setup. It's a single pass radiator, and a lot of times, especially in Subarus, the end tanks are made of plastic. Okay, there's a few different reasons they do this. A lot of it is cost. Some of it is you'd actually be very surprised at how efficient a stock radiator can be, but it doesn't have a ton of cooling capacity. So this is where you start getting into aftermarket radiators. Most aftermarket radiators that most people think about, you're gonna have kind of your crummier brands, your Mishimoto's or eBay brands. A little bit above that, you're gonna end up with your CSF or Koyo, which both are pretty solid for a lot of people. Work out really well. If you've got a GR or a GD, even some GCs, if you're those radiator setups, if set up correctly, will work pretty well. A lot of them tend to get quite a bit thicker. They tend to be fully aluminum. The end tanks tend to be aluminum also, and they're quite a bit more efficient. And they're a lot better at keeping your coolant temps where you want. Where your coolant temps should be, that's actually probably a pretty good thing we should talk about. I recommend for street cars, if you're seeing any temps above 210, normally, like just kind of driving around or maybe playing around on the street a little bit, if it creeps over when you're doing Mexico pulls, that's a little different. But if you're just driving around and you're seeing temps on a hot day and they start going above 210, you may want to think about an aftermarket radiator. I'm willing to believe if you're seeing above 210 temps, you're probably running some sort of intercooler in the front. You've got something in the front that maybe is restricting air quite a bit. Okay. So that can definitely be a problem. Airflow with a radiator and any heat exchanger is going to be key here. So the single pass radiators basically mean air goes in, coolant comes in, it passes through the radiator, and then right back into the it makes one pass through the radiator from in most single pass situations it's top to bottom, and it makes its way out. So it's pretty simple. Coolant flow would be from the top to the bottom, and so it'd be in the top, out the bottom, and that's all the you would see of it. No. Um, again, so if you're driving around on the street, um, how big? We will get into your front mount intercooler stuff here in a second. Radiators first. So, if you're driving around on the street, you see something over about 210. I would be a little worried. If you're on track and you're beating the shit out of your car, I would say if you're at about 230, you need to, if you're about to finish your lap, then get out of it. Okay. But 230, if you're like running around at a sustained 230, that's pretty high. Okay. And we need to work on that. But if it's like a really hot day and you're on the banger of bangingest laps, you know, a time attack car or something like that, and you're trying to finish out that lap, 230, like, don't go finish another lap at 230. Okay. Like, finish your lap, be done with it. Don't go for another one. Anything more than that, it's really bad noise. You don't want to live at 230. That's like, I'm just finishing the lap up, but that's where you need to start getting worried, is about 230. 235 to 240, you abort the lap. You slow right the hell down and you get that thing cooling down. Okay. You really want to try to keep that thing, if you can. You're ideally trying to keep it under 210 degrees. Okay, it doesn't seem like it's a whole lot. If you can keep it under 200, that's great. It's got to stay over 180 though. That's why you have a thermostat, or your engine doesn't run correctly. So there's a way you need to set it up. Passenger top outlet left over. Josh, you and I are gonna have. Shut up. I love you, man. I'm getting there. God. Okay. So next, man, you got me all messed up. Okay. So STI pulls out of S at 248 degrees. Found that out the hard way. Yeah, that's getting hot, man. You don't want to be running around at 248. You should never see 248 as far as coolant temps. That is way into the danger zone. Okay. We do not want to be seeing that. Don't be doing that. Okay. If you are seeing temps that are high, there are different things you can do to help remedy this. With just like you can with any heat exchanger. But the first thing a lot of people tend to do is change out their heat exchanger itself. And again, if you have an OEM heat exchanger, that might be something you want to do. If you have an aftermarket heat exchanger and you're still having problems with this, so let's say you have an aftermarket radiator, you still have problems with heat. I would seriously start looking into maybe some other things and not so much the core. If you've got a CSF or a Koyo and you have anything but a VA, I'm going to highly, highly recommend that you start looking into ducting before anything else. A VA, on the other hand, ducting helps, but it's only going to help so much. The front end of that car is goofy. So if you've got a GD, GR, even a B or Z FRS, VA, WRX, well, VAs just in general kind of suck, but start with ducting, okay? Now, when I talk about ducting, what am I talking about? First thing I'm going to put out there is, like, you can have the best heat exchanger in the world. So let's say you've got our badass PWR, okay? You've got a shit hot, mad, crazy track slut. You know, let's say you stuck it in a GR, which has some decent front end cooling. Okay, so you've got this 08 STI, and it makes like 600 horsepower and things badass. Okay, but it's getting hot. You have two options: spend a whole bunch of time making ducting on your already existing core, or spend a whole bunch of money and get yourself a really expensive radiator. In this situation, the gains are probably more going to come from the ducting. Okay, the best heat exchanger you can get with bad ducting will always get outperformed by a lesser quality heat exchanger with good ducting. Ducting is what's basically a heat exchanger almost entirely works on pressure. Okay, the concept of a heat exchanger, for it to work, is air needs to pass through it. Okay, if air does not pass through the heat exchanger, it doesn't work. So the key to that is you need to have high pressure on the front of the heat exchanger and low pressure on the back of the heat exchanger to promote air to go through it. If you have a bunch of open air around the heat exchanger, hence why sticking a oil cooler out the front of your car or just dangling somewhere, why it doesn't work no matter how big it is, or a top mount intercooler with no ducting, no matter how big it is, it's not going to be very efficient. Ducting is everything. What you're trying to do is force the air to go through the heat exchanger. If it doesn't go through the heat exchanger, it does not work. Okay? There's a few different ways to get air through the heat exchanger. Ducting is a huge one. When you're at low speeds, or maybe you do a bunch of autocross or something like that, some really, really good fans go a really long way. But you can run into issues with, say, like a radiator shroud or something like that, where at really low speeds or parked or whatever, that's able to create this really low pressure on the back of the core, basically sucking air through even if you're stopped. But when you're going at speed, if it's sealed off on the back side of it, air can't pass through. It creates really, really high pressure zones, and then air no longer can pass through the radiator, and it makes it really inefficient. This is why radiator shrouds can be a positive and a negative depending on what you're doing with the vehicle. Again, low speeds, autocross, driving around the street, stuff like that, maybe even drag racing, radiator shrouds can be super effective. High speed stuff, so we're talking higher speed autocross stuff, I don't know, Mexico racing, and anything you're doing with track, you want air to be able to pass through. Now, that fan might not be as effective at idle or running around, but it's going to be that engine's going to cool much better when you're using it the way you're trying to use it. So again, somebody just posted something about a Miata paired with a Michi-Rad for good. Yeah, but that Miata probably makes 120 horsepower. And now we're going to go back to this. Energy makes heat. Horsepower is a whole lot of things making energy. Okay? And that creates heat. And there's a lot more energy with even a 300 horsepower Subaru than a 120 horsepower Miata. That it's going to need that sort of cooling. So now, so ducting, what ducting is going to do is create a lot of high pressure in front of the heat exchanger. Okay, if you ducting in the front, but then behind the heat exchanger is almost as important as in the front. You have to be able to get rid of that pressure to the best of your ability, okay? And you also have to think about where that air and where that pressure is going. You're trying to keep that as low as possible. So, in a lot of different cases, track cars, things like that, you're going to see, if we're talking about radiators, you're going to see hood vents. You're going to see a lot of things like hood vents, or they're actually going to make a duct that goes from the radiator, if you have room to do it, a duct that goes from the radiator right up to the hood. But anything you can do to create a nice low pressure zone where air is getting sucked out at speed and you're relieving pressure under the hood is going to create low pressure in your engine bay, and it's going to then promote air to go through your heat exchanger. It's not for removing heat, it's for removing pressure. So that is really, really something that people mess up. Now, with Subarus, we have these damn hood scoops, okay? Now, for a top mount intercooler, it's there's trade-offs to be made. There's for the packaging constraints of what we have, a top mount actually works really well at certain horsepower levels. But again, if you, let's say you have a front mount intercooler, but you left your top mount vent open, in a lot of cases, you're actually making your situation worse, because at speed, you're creating high pressure under your hood, and you have no way to get rid of that pressure. Okay, so it may behoove you would be surprised if you were to plug that hole, that your coolant temps would go down. So most hoods with most vented hoods, there was at least some thought put into this. Even my Cybon hood that I run on Boogie, it's nothing fancy. Somebody just posted in the chat, what about reverse scoops? Some reverse scoops actually work really well. Some are complete crap. But yeah, the concept is there. You would basically turn your scoop hole into a duct, but you have to make sure that it's creating negative pressure and not positive pressure. Because if you just leave the hole there, the rear of that hole is probably going to be higher than the front, and it's going to scoop air. So you may need to set up a gurney flap or something. You got to come up with something there. Some sort of leading edge, make low pressure for the hole that you have there. If you don't do that, ain't gonna work. Okay. So let me get back to my notes here, because I got all sorts of fun stuff. We can go into a little more advanced ducting stuff here in a minute. But let me get back to radiators here. So you got different types of radiators. You got your single pass, dual pass, and triple pass when we're talking about Subarus. Now, essentially what that means is how many times does the coolant have to make a pass through the length or the height, and depending on the situation of the radiator. Now, a single pass radiator, that's going to basically, coolant's going to come in, make one pass through the radiator. So it's just top, bottom, and out it goes. Okay. A dual pass radiator, the end tanks tend to be on the side. Okay. And there's a few different ways to do that. Actually, they could be top, bottom also. But either way, it's gonna go in. The radiator core is basically going to kind of be cut in half, where it'll be blocked off at the end tank on one in the center, and it's going to make a pass up through it, go over, and then come back down. So essentially, it's going to make the coolant has to stay in the radiator a little longer. The concept of that is the longer it stays in the radiator, the more cooling effect it should have. Now, that can actually raise coolant pressures and things of that nature. So you can't just haphazardly toss, some random dual pass in your car, some random triple pass in your car, and expect results. Okay, it takes a lot of there's some engineering behind it, which is one of the reasons our damn radiator is so expensive. So then you have triple pass radiators, and for example, talking about Subarus, and the only one I think I know of that's off the shelf right now is like our IAG partnership radiator that we did with PWR. PWR made us a triple pass radiator out of one of the best cores that they make, and essentially triple pass meaning it goes through a column. It goes through one section of the radiator, turns around, goes back through, turns around one more time, and comes back through again. So it's in the coolant itself is in the radiator for a very long period of time. Okay, and thankfully, PWR knows what they're doing, and they managed to pull this off without adding much pressure. You can't really just do that on a crummier core and hope it'll work. So essentially, that's how the reason we had to go to the triple pass radiator with the VA chassis in specific is VA chassis is cool like shit and their airflow is ass. I've said this about 100 times, and you can duct the living crap out of it. You can put a really nice radiator in it. You can do all sorts of stuff. But something had to be done to make that core more efficient. And we found this to be the best option. And we tested the shit out of this thing, and it works. This is about the only effective option we've found for a VA. fits a GR just fine. Honestly, it might even be a little overkill for a GR, but if you want the best radiator for a GR, here it is. Okay. In my opinion, if you are a track slut VA guy, this may be your only option. But due to the triple pass design, we actually had to move the upper coolant hose over, and the upper coolant inlet over. So we then had to provide hoses too. So a lot of stuff had to change for this. But again, worth it. Yeah, that radiator is a work of art. There's a lot of different things that can go into what'll make a heat exchanger good, bad, whatever. Why can't some eBay manufacturer make the same thing that PWR makes? This is going to go into different types of heat exchangers. Okay. The two major types that we're talking about, for the most part, both of them being air to air or water to air or some sort of situation like that. They're going to be tube fin and bar plate. Now, I can't say I've ever seen a bar plate radiator, but I've definitely seen this a lot with intercoolers. And long story short, a lot of this comes down to fin density and ease of manufacturing. Okay. Basically, if you were to look at a good radiator versus kind of a crummy one, the first you're going to notice is how dense the fins are. You're immediately going to look at it and see how close together and how many fins are in there. The more fins and the more close together they actually are, yet still letting air pass through, the more efficient that radiator is going to be. Now, there's some stuff going on that you can't see, like what's going on inside of the tubes, but on the outside, just fin density in general can really give you a really good concept of, is this kind of crummy or not? And if you pick up some junk ass eBay intercooler, eBay radiator, and then compare it to a decent brand, like let's just say a CSF or or manage to put it next to a PWR, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. The fin density is triple, quadruple, even more, and it is not easy to produce heat exchangers with that type of fin density. And that's one of the big reasons that prices go right through the roof. Done correctly, though, this is why F1 teams and NASCAR and whatever, they go to PWR, is they're able to not only have this crazy fin density, but also have flow rates that are just ridiculous. So, yeah. So it's absolutely crazy what you can do with a really, really well-engineered core. So we're gonna chat a little bit. I tell you what, I see Filippo in here. Filippo, when did we build that car, Filippo? 17, 18? Either way, literally the most state-of-the-art, bleeding edge of what you could do with a VA at the time. I really wish this radiator existed when he did that. I have a feeling that this radiator at some point is probably going to end up on that car. So we did our best with what we could, and it still turned out awesome. So let us chat. Not ducking, more advanced Finale principle. Peeking through here to see where I want to go from here. Let's talk about intercoolers. Okay. First thing, when we're talking about Subarus, you have two different placements of intercoolers that most people talk about. You have, and if I have any other questions about radiators, like speak now or forever hold your peace in the chat. Let's hear it. And if not, I'm hitting it. We're gonna continue on. All right, let's talk about intercoolers. There are two types of intercoolers that you hear most about with Subarus as far as location. You have top mount, which this is the reason most turbo Subarus have hood scoops. And then you have front mount, where we take this front mount with this larger intercooler core, and we try to stuff it in the front of the car in a effort for us to make a larger core with more surface area and more depth, see cleaner air. Okay. There's advantages and disadvantages to both of these. I'm really not going to get too massive into, branding or whatever. And we're not going to, I don't want to get into intercooler piping too hardcore, but let's talk about your advantages of a top mount is the core is actually fairly small, and it's very easy, even if it does get heat soaked, to dissipate that heat because it is so small. The problem is it's sitting on top of your intercooler or on top of your engine, and if you're not moving and air's not passing through it, it's actually fairly easy for it to get really, really soaked with heat, so really hot, and then your intake temps go up. This is where drag racers tend to not be a big fan of top mount intercoolers. You tend to see this with autocrossers too, where they're sitting in line a lot. And if you're sitting in line a lot with the engine on, it can get that top mount intercooler hot. There's a few different ways to help with that. Spray some water on it. Some people I've heard, sticking ice, all sorts of different things. But long story short, heat rises, it's on the top, it's going to get hot. But the second you start getting air through it, the temps start to drop. Now, how fast can your ECU respond to those temps dropping? That's a whole nother discussion. Okay? Completely different discussion. When the problem with the top mount and why we don't stick with top mounts on higher power cars is there's really not enough area to put a larger intercooler there, and you start running into issues with being able to get air to flow over it or through it when you start making it significantly larger. One of the things that I really like that's out there, by the way, is the process was verticooler, which is kind of like a top mount, but it sits more upright, and air, it's a lot easier for air to make its way through it. Honestly, if you have a plastic intake manifold, and you can get a verticooler, so I think the only things you can get it for are the 08 to 14 WRX and the 15 to 21 WRX. I think are the only things you can get verticoolers for. But if you can get a verticooler, and you plan on making less than 400 horsepower, 450-ish even, that's a killer setup. Okay, I love that. But the rest of us, plebes, with our metal intake manifolds and better working everything else, and yeah, so intake manifolds and better looking everything else, we have to go to a front mount. Now, the downside with a front mount is you also add a ton of intercooler piping. You're talking about, our turbo sits way up in the top and in the rear, which is why a top mount works really well, because the intercooler piping is comically short. We're talking less than 1 foot. And then you turn it into anywhere between 12 and 18 feet of piping. And that happens very, very quick. Very, very quick. And all of that has to be pressurized before anything happens. So it can hurt throttle response and things of that nature. If you got a really big turbo, you really don't even notice. Okay. But if you're still on like a stock turbo, front mount might not be the answer for you. Okay. Front mount might not be the answer for you. Now, the biggest problem with the front mount, in my opinion, is also its biggest advantage. It's where it's located. Now, yes, if you stick it in the front, you have a whole lot more room to put a big core, and the first thing air runs into is that. Okay? And they tend to be fairly efficient there. But the problem is there are heat exchangers behind that heat exchanger that now are getting robbed of air. Namely, especially in a VA in the way the ducting's set up, is the radiator. The radiator is going to get choked of air. There's not much you can do. It's just an unfortunate reality. It's just an unfortunate reality of it. So there's a few different things you can do. One is the type of core. So I was talking about tube fin and a bar plate a little bit, but when you have a tube fin radiator, they tend to not only be a little lighter, flow through them. There's one of the downsides of super high fin density is they can be a little restrictive of letting air through, even though the heat exchanger might be really efficient. It might not be letting a ton of air through at a decent velocity. But tube fins tend to flow a little better than bar plate. Bar plate design intercoolers tend to be the ones that you see most of the time used with front mount intercoolers and a lot of aftermarket top mounts. These are a heat exchanger that's actually a little easier to cut and modify, which is why aftermarket companies tend to use them. And they actually, because you can fairly easily jack the fin density right through the roof on them, they tend to be fairly efficient at cooling a turbocharger's charge, but not letting air through. Also, they tend to be fairly heavy. But, I mean, for its size, you have a very hard time arguing this. Okay? So, a lot of your major companies are using bar plate. So, Cobb, Perrin, ETS, AMS, Garrett, all of these companies are using bar plate front mounts. You don't see a ton of tube fin front mounts here currently. I think you're going to start seeing more now that taking your really high-powered 4-cylinder turbocharged car to the track has really started to become more of a thing. PWR is a really good example. I'm running a Koyo front mount, a Koyo core and custom end tanks. My reasoning, I'll explain that here in a second. What is that company? There's a few Australian companies that it's just escaping my brain right now. But either way, there are a bunch of tube fin companies out there. They're just not super available here in the States unless you start getting custom. Tube fin radiator or intercoolers tend to allow more air through, but they need more physical size to achieve the same amount of cooling. Okay, so like, let's say a 3-inch ETS will probably be as efficient as a 4.5-inch Koyo if we're talking about radiators. Okay, Plasma Man. That's what I was talking about. Plasma Man makes some really good tube fin radiators. Most of the Aussies are running Plasma Man radiators. Thank you, sir. This is why I have the guys in the comments, in the chat, helping us out. If you want to be a part of that chat, join the Discord. But either way, one of the reasons we went from a ETS tube fin radiator, bar plate intercooler to a fairly nice, I didn't pick the brand, but the core looked really nice and it has worked out really good for us. A Koyo core on our intercooler on Boogie was having coolant issues. And a really easy fix to that was get more air to the radiator through the intercooler. Like, air has to pass through the intercooler to get there anyway. Try to make it more efficient. And that's what we did. And it helped a ton. Now, our coolant temps, even on Road America, are under 210 all the time. It's awesome. Like, our coolant temps are phenomenal. Again, so I think the next thing you're going to start seeing, especially for VA guys, is a tube fin radiator, I think or a tube fin intercooler is going to help out a lot. If you are still having coolant issues and you have a big power car and you're taking it to the track, you may want to think about changing your intercooler. Your intercooler may actually be very much a culprit, because you got to think that heat's all getting let off too. So let's say it's 80 degrees outside, okay? And then your air intake temps are 120 because you're full into this, okay? 120 degree. It's trying to, and if you've got a really efficient core, you're probably getting your air intake temps back down to like 95, 90, okay? The rest of that heat has now just got crapped out the back right into your radiator. So your radiator is actually dealing like 120 degree air temps, not the 80 degrees that it is outside. You got to think about it that way. Plus, how much of that air is actually getting through there? Okay. the other thing to think about is even if you set up ducting in the front of your core, okay, so you want to set up some sort of ducting in the front of your intercooler core, and this is something that's also hard with VAs, but set up some sort of ducting in the front of your intercooler core. If it's wide open behind your intercooler, the air is not going to go through your radiator. It's going to take path of least resistance. If it's lower pressure to go around your radiator than through it, it's going to go around it. So ducting between your cores matters. Yeah, so it can be rough. One of the nice things about tube thin intercoolers is they do tend to be lighter, but on top of that, they're lighter for the same size, but you have to go to a thicker. You tend to have to size up quite a bit, so the weight savings isn't as much as you would think. So, one of the questions I got, the FA engine, is it more advantageous to try to retain the top mount intercooler, giving the VA cooling inefficiencies? I mean, the VA doesn't have any more cooling inefficiencies as the EJ does, in all reality. One of the things I really like about going to a front mount on a VA or the new VB is the turbo is low and at the front. So that intercooler piping problem that I just talked about a second ago is significantly less of a problem for that. It's actually shorter for you to put a front mount intercooler on than you to run a top mount. So, my 2 cents, it's really going to depend on if you're having cooling issues or not. Some ducting would fix a ton. Okay. But a front mount intercooler works really good on the VA. On the, on the rest of us EJ guys, we can run into problems, okay? Especially if we're building bigger power cars. If you're more of a stock car and you can get away with still running a top mount, you may want to think about it, okay? Depending on what you're doing. It causes its own issues, especially with throttle response. I don't know how much we're going to want to talk about intercoolers. I know I got asked about V-mounts, so let's talk about that. So V-mount, essentially what it is instead of putting your intercooler in front of your radiator, what you would do, and these are set up a few different ways, you would kind of split it, okay? Your radiator would get its own air, and your intercooler would get its own air, and a lot of times the shape that comes from that tends to be in the shape of a V. The one that most people tend to bring up is the Process West V-mount, where essentially the intercooler would go into the grill area of the vehicle, and then the radiator would sit kind of tilted back and allow it to have enough surface area and still have enough size for air to pass through it. V-mounts can work, okay? There's a few different scenarios in which they work. The problem you tend to run into is you can't put a large enough core to make serious power. But set up correctly, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too with intercooler piping, because it's going to shorten your intercooler piping. So if we're talking about, say, the Process West kit, I don't really recommend taking that over 500 wheel. The intercooler itself is just kind of too small for it. The radiator, I haven't had a chance to really beat the snot out of it to see if it can keep up, but it does look like a very efficient core. But in Subarus, it isn't like an RX-7 or something like that, where there's heaps of area under the hood to play with that sort of stuff. So you end up having really odd setups with Subarus. Okay? It's another thing we have a problem with a Subaru is ducting out of the hood from your radiator. It would drastically increase the efficiency of the radiator, but there's no way to do it because we have an engine shoved right up in there because the engine sits so far forward due to the fact the car is all-wheel drive. With a BRZ, there's a little bit more room, but not a ton. And you still run kind of into the same issue. If you could duct out of the hood, it definitely would make a difference. It'd even make a difference in aerodynamics. add an intercooler to that situation. Again, you can ramp up the efficiency if you put them in line. If you split them, you still have to figure out where that air is going to go. And if the air's making its way under the car, that may not be a good thing. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about here in a few minutes when we get into ducting. So now we got to talk about oil coolers. Okay. You have a few different types of oil coolers. Most of the time when people are thinking about an oil cooler, they're thinking about an oil to air oil cooler. That tends to be most of your aftermarket oil coolers. Air passes through it, cools down the oil. There's a lot of different concepts to how large your oil cooler needs to be. I've heard of people taking 12-row oil coolers, taking them on track and being fine at 800 horsepower, but their ducting was phenomenal. I've seen people like myself, I think we have a 19-row, and we do pretty damn well with the power that we make, and it took us a long time to get ducting where it is, but we don't see oil temps over 220, which is killer with the amount of power and how fast we're going. But it took us years to get to that point. Absolutely years to get to that point. I probably have 10 iterations of, the headlight mounted exit out the hood oil cooler ducting to get it set up. 16 row. Okay. So again, not even like a crazy huge, there's 19 row, 24 row. The larger these coolers are, the more surface area you have to work. Technically, the more cooling capacity you have. But with that stated, like I said earlier, the best heat exchanger, the largest heat exchanger, whatever, with bad ducting will always get outperformed by a smaller heat exchanger or a lesser heat exchanger that is ducted really well. Ducting is absolutely massive. Air in, air out is absolutely massive to making a heat exchanger function. If you don't have a plan for both air in and air out, it's not going to be efficient. It doesn't matter how good the core is. You can throw all the money you want at it. If it sucks, it sucks. That's all there is to it. Okay? So oil coolers, I gotta be real, there's not a ton of great aftermarket options that you just buy a kit. I'm just gonna go out and say this right now. Do not put a Mishimoto oil cooler on your car. They're junk. Okay? They're just the lines are trash. The core itself isn't great. They're not good. So do not do it. I don't care if it's a street car, track car, whatever. It's just flat out dangerous. They suck. Okay. My recommendation for most people, if you need a more serious oil cooler, is 1, delete the factory oil cooler / warmer. Okay. That is actually a restriction. We found that on our Spintron that it's a pretty massive restriction, especially at higher RPM. So if you're living at higher RPM, that will become a massive oil restriction. 2, Cetrab. Cetrab is basically your go-to company for getting oil cooler stuff. They make by far the best oil cooler sandwich adapter on the market, Cetrab sandwich adapter, and then a Cetrab cooler. And then you can use Vibrant or a bunch of different companies for fittings. We're really big fans of Fragola here. Fragola is a really great place to get your fittings and lines. I highly recommend do not undersize your fittings too. I think everything on ours is -12. Yeah. You want to have -10 or -12 larger lines for this. You don't want to run a smaller like fuel line size. They need to be large because they need to flow a pretty serious amount of volume. Okay, so -10, -12, fairly large stuff. Where you put this matters a lot. Okay, where you put this matters a lot. Well, let's get back to the thermostat here real quick. They make 2 different types of sandwich adapters. Essentially, it's going to replace your factory oil cooler if you have one. And it's going to go right to the block, and then your oil filter will go straight to that. Okay, this setup works really well on these cars. The one thing you're going to run into is running lines over or under the header, depending on how you have it set up. You got to make sure that it's at no point ever touching the header, and it is protected in any possible way. Wraps, like if you can make yourself a little heat shield, whatever you got to do, just keep it the F away from the header, okay? It's very easy to melt those lines and burn your entire car down. DI fire sleeve is an extraordinarily good option, but even then, keep it the F away from the header, okay? There needs to be an air gap. It at no point can ever rest on the header, especially if you're doing track use. Oh my God, because you'll just get that shit red hot and it'll melt right through it. I don't care how good the fire sleeve is, and DEI is the best. Huge, can't stress it enough, cannot stress it enough, okay? So, I highly recommend a thermostatic oil cooler, and what that means is it's got a small thermostat in it. Most of the time they open at 180 degrees, where it's going to allow the temperatures in your car, your oil temps, to get up to 180 degrees before it opens, and then the heat exchanger even sees anything, okay? So you want to get yourself a thermostatic oil cooler, even if it's track use all the time. Highly recommend thermostatic oil cooler. We might be able to post some stuff up or whatever, but there's a few different ways to do this. You can even check out the IAG Insiders Lounge or Track Subies. They're constantly talking about different ways to do oil coolers and things of that nature, and what sandwich adapter to use tends to come up quite a bit. My recommendation is always going to be Setrap. How you route those lines is a real pain in the ass to make sure it doesn't hit the header, but where you're going to put this cooler can make a massive, massive, massive effect on how well it's going to work. Okay? If you stick this heat exchanger in front of your radiator, which a lot of people tend to do, you're going to dump all of that really hot oil temp right into your radiator. So if you're on track and you're getting 220, 230 temps, those temps are dumping right into your radiator, okay? Now, if you duct the living crap out of it and you get, enough volume of air through there, it'll still function like that. But you tend to see a lot of people will have a big front mount intercooler, then they'll have a big long oil cooler in the grill, and behind there somewhere is a radiator, and then they're complaining that their car's overheating. Well, no shit. A lot of people tend to put them in fog light areas, okay? This is good and bad all at the same time. Serapin Wolf, great question. That's a great question. How bad are running longer lines for safety going to hurt the pressure of the flow? Not as bad as you would think, okay? It's significantly worth it for you to run a longer line than worry about pressure. There is an ever so slight pressure drop, but if that amount of pressure drop, if that amount of pressure drop is detrimental to keeping your engine alive, you have other problems. Okay? A lot of people tend to run they either run their oil cooler behind their intercooler in front of their radiators, so like in between, hoping air is going to somehow go through that, or they put it in their grill and dump all the oil cooler might even be kind of efficient there. If it's ducted correctly, but you're dumping all that heat into your radiator. So a lot of people tend to put it in the fog light area. The fog light area actually works really well, and it's pretty easy to build some pretty decent ducting there to where you can get a whole lot of air in. But what everybody seems to forget is you need to get the air out. And no matter which way you're looking at this, you're looking at it in the form of pressures, okay? You want high pressure in front of the heat exchanger, low pressure behind it. Well, the higher the pressure is in the front, the higher the pressure is going to get behind it. You have to be able to expel it, okay? So you do run into situations where people have this really nice duct heat exchanger, and then it just pours into the fender well, or into that fog light area behind their bumper. There's nowhere for a large amount of area to go. So it seems pretty efficient until they start going fast. And when they start going fast, it goes right in the toilet. That turns into a absolutely massive problem too, where you start going fast, you build up all this pressure behind the heat exchanger, and then air no longer can go through it because there's this huge bubble of air. Okay, you can't do that. So then what you end up having is people trying to vent that pressure into their fender well. Well, that doesn't work all the time either, because one of the things you're trying to do, especially with a track car, especially with a Subaru that understeers really bad, is you're trying everything humanly possible to keep as much pressure out of the wheel wells as you can, especially the front ones. This is why fender vents exist. That's why you'll see a lot of splitters have these really crazy diverters, so air tries to make its way around the wheel well. This is why you see those track life cut out fenders and things like that. If they're trying to get pressure out from in there. If you have your oil cooler, it's just ducted straight through your oil cooler, and it is just pouring that air and pouring that pressure into your heat exchanger or into your fender well, your wheel well there. You're hurting your own handling. Okay, so in almost every case, it makes sense for you to duct it before your fender well, or have some provision to shove it into your engine bay if that's ducted really well, or something. Okay, you need to be able to get air out. And so this is one of the things I gotta say GRs are built so lovely for. The front end of a GR, I swear to God, was designed specifically for to be used in a situation like Time Attack. They have these lovely front fog lights that pop out really easy. You can build these gorgeous ducts, and then they also have these nice little side vents that leave off the side and give you this beautiful exit, which is plenty large enough to evacuate pretty much any amount of pressure you need. They work so well. They work phenomenal. It's a little harder in VAs. They got a little shorter overhang there. GDs, same situation. GCs, practically impossible. It can be done. But it's a pain in the ass. I don't have a pick of Grams, but Grams is the perfect example. This is one of the reasons with Boogie why I was really big on doing the headlight. I wanna run air into the headlight and then out the hood, because there needs to be a plan for air in and air out, and that works really well. So, with any heat exchanger, this should be a thought of yours. How are you getting air out? Where is all this pressure going, especially at speed? Okay, this can be an absolutely massive problem. Again, going back to this, you got to have a plan. Okay, before you start buying parts, draw the whole thing out. Start measuring things. Figure out how you can do it. A heat exchanger that's sitting at an angle, as long as it's ducted okay, is fine. As long as there's a low pressure exit. Look at it as pressure, not which way the wind goes. It's pressure. Pressure is all that matters. Okay. So one of the things I had in here is, what do you think about CSF? Jackson Racing also has CSF make their radiators. But the radiator with the oil cooler inside of it. I've got a couple of different thoughts on that. That actually works significantly better than you would think for a 450 horsepower car or less. I run the Jackson Racing one, again, made by CSF, on my BRZ. It's great, but it's NA. Okay, I'm not pouring a ton of heat into it. But it doesn't matter. It could be 120 degrees out. I can just hot lap the living shit out of it. It doesn't care. Okay. But if I were to make anything with some more serious horsepower, yeah, I'd want to change that up. And the other downside is, if you're a little worried about losing an engine, which we're talking larger Time Attack cars and stuff, there's Grams. Oh my God, Grams is set up so well. If you're a bigger power car, or you're planning on doing some maybe endurance racing or something like that, keeping the heat exchanger separate cleaning a oil cooler core out is extraordinarily hard, and honestly it really just isn't something you can properly do. You're running a risk if you ever use that oil cooler again if you had a bearing failure. Okay, you're really running that risk. So I'd really recommend that you keep the heat exchangers separate so you don't have to buy a new radiator and oil cooler. That would suck. Okay, but if this is like every once in a while I go fart around at the track, I still got a top mount on my STI, you know, it's making less than 400. Honestly, that CSF like dual radiator oil cooler setup, it ain't bad. It does a pretty damn good job. Okay, but if it's more of a competition situation, I'd recommend keeping them separated. Oh, the factory oil cooler works in kind of the same principle. And again, we've already kind of went over that's really not up to snuff if you plan on any track use. Driving around on the streets, totally fine. Yeah, I'm interested to see. Josh is trying to do Graham's approach, which Graham has a GR that he's done some really good ducting with. Josh is trying to do it on a VA. I'd be really excited to see pictures of that if you ever get a chance, man. So, basically, Brunelli's principle states an increase in speed of a fluid occurs simultaneously with a decrease in pressure or a decrease in the fluid's potential energy. Okay? So, the same concept that they use to figure out how to make a wing work can also be used to really make your ducting work. You may not realize this, but you only need about a quarter to a third of the surface area of your heat exchanger to make a duct that will function extraordinarily well. But some of the same concepts that go into designing a rear diffuser also go into designing this. If you can make a nice sloped curve into the heat exchanger, what'll happen is the air will actually slow down. And when you slow it down, you actually increase the potential energy and or basically just make the air thicker. And it will make without you having to have this huge volume of air, you can actually make the air more efficient going through your cooler. So your heat exchanger will become more efficient if you build ducting correctly. Got to be real. The real pain in the ass to build the ducting correctly. But for a oil cooler, there's ways you can do that pretty easy. A little harder for us with how we set up our intercoolers and radiators on all-wheel drive Subarus. With BRZs, you actually have a little room to play with there. But getting fancy with your ducting may actually net you some very serious gains. Okay. Cortez just says, are you running brake ducts through that same area too? Well, long story short, with time attack cars, you tend to not mess with brake ducting too much. Now, if you were doing an endurance car, you may have to rethink some stuff about that. But if you got time, you can figure it out. Okay. If you got to split the air, whatever you got to do, there's a lot of different ways to pull that off. Man, where am I at with this? I think I got a little lost, but I think I hit all the major type of heat exchangers. Long story short, if you pull one thing away from this, it's ducting is extremely important. Okay. And the best heat exchanger with bad ducting will always outperform a lesser quality exchanger. The best heat exchanger with bad ducting will always get outperformed by a lesser quality exchanger with being ducted properly. Basically, ducting is important, almost or as important as your heat exchanger itself. Do not skip on that. Do you still want to talk about air to water at all? Sure. So one of the things you don't see on Subarus a whole lot, at least modern Subarus a whole lot, are air-water intercoolers. This same concept also kind of translates into the water-oil heat exchanger, but basically, instead of it being air that pulls the heat away, you have a coolant of some sort, water, that pulls the heat away. So basically your cooling charge would go through a heat exchanger that has some sort of fluid being piped through it. Now, the cool thing about this is the exchanger itself tends to be fairly small. The downside to this is the complexity of all this goes up quite a bit. Okay, you now need a pump to be moving that fluid that is separate from your coolant, because you don't want hot coolant running through there. So you need a separate pump. You're going to need some sort of separate reservoir, and you are going to need a separate heat exchanger of some sort, because just because you got the air out, that you've got that hot air energy out of your intercooler, out of that intake charge, it's now in that water. You're going to immediately heat soak that water if you don't have either A, a ton of water, which is heavy, or B, some sort of heat exchanger to let it go. Then you got to think about, where am I putting this heat exchanger? In the end, the full system tends to weigh more and still has a heat exchanger that needs to see some form of fresh air. There's an argument to be made that in a drag situation, it'll work out really well. Air-water intercoolers tend to be what you see on, a lot of like really high-end big V8 drag cars and stuff like that. They tend to run ice in their water and all sorts of crap, and just keep it as cold as humanly possible, and it works really well. You're not going to see that a whole lot on street Subarus. Tended to run things like that too. Way back in the day, there was air-water intercoolers. You don't see that hardly at all in any modern vehicle is an air-water intercooler, because of the complexity of it, and you still have to have a heat exchanger. So, Zach, what size lines do you recommend for oil coolers? -10 or -12. Okay. We're running -12s on Boogie. I'm almost positive they're -12. You want some thick boy lines, okay? And I can't stress that enough. You really want to have some thick boy lines there. Don't mess around with that. The volume of that's obviously going to go way up, but the volume of your oil is going to go up, so that means, it's going to take more oil for you to do an oil change. But the good part of it is the volume goes up, so you have more oil to transfer heat into. So global temps should actually go down a little bit. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the basics of heat exchangers. Heat exchangers work off of pressure. Okay. It's not airflow, it's pressure. So if you just stick some random heat exchanger out into some air, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be effective. Ducting is everything. And trying to have a funnel into it is actually significantly less effective than having almost a reverse funnel, or a just straight walls going straight into it, because you're trying to raise the pressure. Again, raising the pressure is the key here. You want to raise the pressure in the front of the heat exchanger, lower the pressure behind it. Air will then pass through it. Air is always going to take path of least resistance. In most cases, when it comes to having to make ducting, get ready to start messing around with CAD. And by CAD, I mean cardboard aided construction or destruction. Cardboard aided drafting, whatever. Cardboard. Bust out the cardboard. You need to bust out the cardboard. You literally cut up a whole heap of cardboard, tape it to where you want, maybe go test with said cardboard on there, to see if what you're doing is in the right direction. Then build it out of something more solid. ABS plastic, aluminum, whatever you got to do. Have somebody weld a bunch of stuff up for you. You can make little tabs and bolt it all together, whatever you got to do. You got to do what you got to do, though. Like Josh just said, we were talking about oil lines. The other thing he's very right about, do not cheap out on your fittings. Frigola, Vibrant, something like that. Don't go to Amazon and get cheap fittings, especially when it comes to oil coolers, because crap fittings will leak. Leaky oil onto a hot header. That's a car burning down. You don't need that in your life, okay? Don't mess around with cheap lines situation, same situation. They get hot, they'll melt, oil come pouring out onto a hot header, burn your car down. It's bad news. And yeah. If you need help making hoses, you got guys like Josh or whatever. One of my favorite people to send people to for making hoses after you figure out what line length you need and kind of what fittings you need is hit up my boy Drew over at Penguin Garage, and he will hook it up. He's really big in the Track Subies community. Drew is awesome. And he can make some extraordinarily nice hoses exactly how you need them. If you kind of just draw out what you need, and I need a thing to do this with about that angle, and it's got this Dewey on here, and I'm going to take a picture of this, and I need it to hook up to that. Drew can do all of that. Drew's phenomenal for that on making custom hoses for custom, and he's a Subaru guy, and Drew understands Subaru. So Drew at Penguin Garage would be my recommendation for that. One day, what I would like to see is the good folks over at IAG Performance. We all sit down and we decide we're going to make some oil cooler kits. Maybe that'll happen in the future. Something I'd like to see because I think the community needs it. I think we kind of hit it, guys. Anybody in the chat, if you got any questions, let's hear it. I'm down to listen to whatever you got. And we can even venture off topic if we need to. What's on y'all's mind? Better be a nice oil cooler kit if you want me to replace my HKS oil cooler. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're doing there, Senior Fuse, but an HKS oil cooler is decent, okay, but it may or may not. You'd be surprised at how much better a good oil cooler kit can be. HKS needs more line volume. HKS needs a better core, in my opinion. Well, I can't fix HKS bling, but we're never going to build something that's like shit. So, ooh, that's a good question. I'll answer that here in a second. Power steering cooler. That's another, if you have other fluids that are getting hot, power steering is a pretty good one. And you want to stick a heat exchanger in there are options. Okay. One option is just make more volume, which is why you see like extremely long lines or whatever. A power steering cooler works identical to a trans cooler or even just an oil cooler. There's really not much to talk about. You don't need a whole lot of cooling for that. It really depends on what you're doing, is if you need a power steering cooler, though. If you need a power steering cooler, you better be doing like endurance racing or something like that. If you're doing 20-minute sessions and you're killing your power steering, maybe you need to think about different power steering fluid. That's all I'm saying. What do we got? Where was that? Okay, I asked earlier, how big is too big for a front mount intercooler? Well, there's a few rule of thumbs for this. But you'd be surprised. It's not as... The bigger you go, the more volume you're going to have to fill. There's no such thing as like going too big unless you start getting like extreme. Like there's no reason to put a 5-inch intercooler on a stock turbo car. You know what I mean? It's not going to make it any more efficient. But like it's also going to depend on brands. So like ETS is a good example. Like their 3-inch core is crazy efficient and will probably outperform, it will absolutely murder Cobb and Perrin at almost the same price. A 4-inch ETS core, I gotta be real, I wouldn't be worried about running 850 wheel through it. I bet you could probably turn 1,000, seriously. And they have a 5-inch core, which is insanity. It doesn't... There's a lot to it. There's not too big or too small. I think we're at a 4.5-inch core on my Koyo tube fin, which is probably going to be very similar to like a 3-inch core or 3.5-inch core from ETS as far as cooling capacity. Okay, but if you were to go say PWR were to make you a core, I bet you their 3-inch core would outperform an HK or I bet you their 2-inch core would probably outperform anybody else's 3-inch, or their 3-inch core would probably outperform most people's 5 inches. Like it's all over the place, man. So there's not like a rule of thumb. I need this thickness for this horsepower. It doesn't really work that way. How did the Flatfest audio recording turn out? I don't know if we ever posted it. I gotta be real. That's kind of a producer Jordan thing. It might pop out here soon. We'll see. I think there was a lot of background noise, and it was just there's a lot going on. What does ETS use for a core? Is it known? I don't think ETS has ever told anybody what they use for a core. Now, here's what I am gonna tell you. I do know that AMS uses Garrett cores. Garrett cores are really are really solid for their sizing. ETS, I'm about 80% sure they're getting their cores from Bell, which is another extraordinarily efficient bar plate core maker, but I can't prove it. I'm not 100% sure where they got that from. Somewhere. I got a 4.5-inch floating around somewhere. Oh, there's a Spearco. Spearco and Garrett are pretty identical. Spearco is another example, not to be mixed up with Sparco, which is a safety brand. Spearco is its own thing. I'm pretty sure Spearco and Garrett are the same core. Could be wrong on that one, but Spearco was its own company that basically made intercoolers out of Garrett cores, is my understanding. Again, don't quote me on that one. But I know Spearco cores are really efficient. Treadstone cores for the money are decent. I will say there are more efficient cores out there. You could do worse than a Treadstone, but you could definitely do better. My 2 cents, if ETS makes a core for you, it's probably your best option. Unless you have a VA or something else that has some cooling issues and you need to figure out some way to get more air to your radiator. The ETS is very, very dense. The fin density is no joke. It's a very, very efficient core, but it can become a real you need a lot of pressure to get air through that at really high speeds. And that could be a bit of an issue. So, in most chassis, it would be fine. And a VA on track, I think an ETS could be an issue. I'm figuring out something with a VA. Point me in the right direction. The right way is I would either look into a Plasma Man, or I would be looking into some sort of tube fin off the shelf core from like Koyo, like we're using on Boogie, or you have a lot of different options. That would be my recommendation. And you get something custom made. And yeah, a lot of custom's going to be going on when you're trying to do some of this shit. Does Plasma Man make a VA front mount kit? I'm not sure. I need to look into it. One of the problems they have is their cars are right-hand drive. Ours are left. And that can actually mess with stuff. But he does make a VA kit. Okay, well, there's an option there. If there's enough interest, maybe IAG will look into picking up Plasma Man. Because I think there's advantages and disadvantages, but man, with a VA, it's super tough because getting air. This was the biggest reason we made that radiator, though, is you'd be surprised how good that radiator actually is. Like, that core is so efficient, it makes up for a lot of the deficiencies everywhere else. So a 3-inch PWR front mount would I bet you'd be really close. But again, the ETS has an advantage because it's bar plate, and the PWR is going to be a lot lighter and it's tube thin. It'll let air through better. But I bet you they perform almost identically, which is saying something that the PWR is a tube thin versus the ETS being bar plate. Another option, Greddy actually still makes some really decent intercoolers. They have an S line, which is kind of like their more crummy line, but their R line intercooler cores are pretty good, and they're tube thin. Hard to cool a VA even with a stock turbo on track. You can see 230 and coolant temps real fast. You can. It's hard to keep a VA cool on track. Yeah, Grit some pretty solid cores. You really can't fault them. Their R line is I'm pretty sure that's what it was called. Their R line cores are pretty damn decent. Senior, no problem. Again, all this depends on what you're going to be using the car for. If it's cruising around on the street, terracing up, you're doing some highway pulls with your buddies or whatever, honestly, the ETS kit's probably your best bet. If you're doing 20-minute track sessions at over 400 wheel, no, we might have to have a conversation about that. If you're doing full blast time attack, honestly, you should be talking about doing custom anyway. I just like seeing all these guys, all these peeps, all these wonderful people making fast cars, going fast, doing cool things with Subarus. I love seeing we're starting to see it more and more. I actually got into a discussion the other day and ended up talking to CJ from the internet. They were talking about, it looks like everybody's parting out their drag cars, which a bunch of people are, and I posted something, and don't part it out, just change what you're doing. Change what you're doing and go to go do time attack with it. Just repurpose the build. And I think there's a pretty decent amount of people who are seriously considering it. Filippo, any thoughts on a transmission cooler for a sequential trans? Well, for time attack, I think you're adding complexity in ways you shouldn't. For endurance racing, for rally, for a lot of other options, a trans cooler may start becoming a necessity. That'd even be with a manual transmission if you're beating it for 20-minute sessions with big power. You know what I mean? But for time attack, I don't think it's something you're really going to have to worry about. We'd have to talk to the sit still, too much robot. It's not sit stilling. Has nothing to do with me sit stilling. It's probably my internet crapping. Yeah, we're almost 2 hours in. Why don't we kill it anyway? I tell you what, guys, we talked about heat exchangers today. It's been good. I hope you learned something. That's really the goal of these, is if you learn something, it's awesome. We got some really juicy content coming. This weekend, I will be at the Subi Fest Midwest event. And then the weekend after, we're trying like hell to see if we can make Grid Life Chicago. I will probably be there in some capacity. We'll see. But really what did you guys, if you learned something, do me a favor. In the comment section of the Spotify, post something there. Like, it was informative. Dewey's a jerk. I don't care. Post something there. I need something. Okay. Give me some reviews. It really helps out. And then share the living shit out of this thing. Okay. Let's get it all over the place. Nice talk about heat exchangers. Everybody can probably listen to this and learn something. So let's do it. I need your help in the community to get that done though. But it's been real fun, and I think we're gonna call it right there, and we will see you next week, where hopefully we have maybe our most epic episode ever. It's gonna be good. I promise you that. All right, folks. Hope you had a good time and maybe accidentally learned something. If you could do us a solid and please subscribe. And I can't stress this enough. Share. Share the link to the podcast. Tell people about the podcast. Come on the podcast. It's the more the merrier, and the more people we have, the more guests we can have, the more fun we can have with this. We want to make this a giant happy family. So thanks, guys.